Bonjour à tous et toutes.
Oh,
Ça me fait plaisir
everybody,
aujourd'hui de vous accueillir
hello.
au troisième webinaire de notre année 2022-2023.
I'm very
Qui est ce
happy
soir sur
to welcome
le
you
thème
all to the third
d'initiatives
webinar
pour la
in
réinsertion communautaire
2023.
autochtone. Je m'appelle Frédéric Armstrong, je
My name
suis
is Frederick
consultant en
Armstrong.
recherche de la
I'm
recherche appliquée pour
co-chair
l'éducation
at
en
the
prison
applied
et
chair
on a le
for
plaisir
education in
aujourd'hui
prison.
d'accueillir avec nous deux éminents spécialistes des questions qui nous occupent aujourd'hui en Mylène Jacou,
So we have the
professeure titulaire
pleasure
à l'École
today
de
to welcome
psychologie et
two
chercheur associé au
specialists,
Centre de droit de
Michel
l'Université de
Jacou
Montréal, ainsi que Justin Tetreault,
and Justin Tetreault,
professeur adjoint de sociologie et d'études autochtones des études de
teacher,
droit et la criminalité et la
professor
justice à l'Université de l'Alberta au campus Augustana,
at University
et
of
qui a
Alberta,
aussi
and
été membre du Prison Project de l'Université d'Alberta.
he was
Alors,
also a member
aujourd'hui,
of the
on
Prison
parle
Project of
du
Alberta.
système
So today
d'éducation
we'll talk about
en
the
prison
education system
qui
in
est
prison,
dédié aux
which
peuples
is
autochtones.
dedicated
Et pour
to
bien
Indigenous people. And
poser le débat, je vais
start
commencer
the
une
debate, I
présentation
will start
brève
the
de
presentation
Jacou
by a
et
brief
partage
contextualization
d'informations sur
and share
l'éducation
information on
autochtone
about
des
the Indigenous
incarcérés au Canada.
situation.
Alors, ce n'est pas le
So
bon écran. Excusez-moi, ah voilà,
it
je
is
l'ai.
not
On
the
l'a.
right
OK,
screen. Okay, it is.
alors, merci beaucoup.
So
Et puis,
thank
donc,
you very much.
pour bien comprendre les initiatives
And so
canadiennes
to
pour la
fully
réinsertion
understand
communautaire
Canadian
autochtone,
initiatives for
il faut
Aboriginal
d'abord
community
comprendre comment ils
reintegration in
fonctionnent. Il
Canada's
faut
prisons and
d'abord avoir un
penitentiaries,
tout
you must
bref
first have a
portrait du
very
système
brief
d'éducation
portrait
dans
of
notre
the
nouveau pays.
education system in Canada's prisons. Could
On
think that
pourrait
there are two
penser
education systems
qu'il y a
basically in
deux systèmes
Canada, in
d'éducation,
prisons and
en
penitentiaries,
gros, là,
since there are
au
two prison
Canada, dans les
jurisdictions in
différentes
Canada.
provinciautés,
There are
puisqu'il y
on
a
one side
deux
the provincial
institutions
detention
carcérales au total.
establishments. There
Il y
are
a d'un côté les
173
établissements
in total which are
provinciaux
designed to house people who are serving a
sur le centre
sentence of 2
penitentiaire du
years
Québec
less a
qui sont
day,
conçus
as well
pour
as people
héberger les
who are in
personnes pour
pretrial
une peine de
detention.
2 ans ou
There are
plus
also federal
sans
penitentiaries
probation
that are
supplémentaire.
designed to house people who
Il
are
y a aussi les
serving a 2-year
pénitenciers fédéraux
sentence.
qui
More
sont
and so
conçus pour
one
héberger
might
les personnes
think,
qui purgent
as I
une peine de
said,
2
that
ans et
there are
plus.
two systems of
Donc, on pourrait
education,
penser
but in fact there are
qu'il y a
not
deux
two,
systèmes
rather
d'éducation,
there are
mais en fait, il n'y
13.
en a pas deux, il y en
System
a
Y
plutôt 13.
13? Quite
Pourquoi
simply because
13?
each province and
Simplement parce que
territory
chaque
is
province et
responsible for
territoire
education on
sont
its
responsables de
territory,
l'éducation
including in
des
prisons
droits,
and
à savoir, y compris
penitentiaries,
dans les prisons
which
et les
therefore
pénitenciers.
supposes that
Il
there are
suppose
rather
donc qu'il y a
13 education
13 systèmes
systems.
d'éducation.
However,
Or, dans
in
les faits, il
fact,
y en
there
a
are
plus,
even more
par
because
exemple,
the
pour
learning
l'éducation et
programs and
l'apprentissage, qui
initiatives differ
diffèrent
from one
d'un établissement
institution
à
to
l'autre.
another. So of
Alors,
course,
bien
in
entendu,
accordance with
en
international
conformité
law,
avec le droit
rights,
international,
federal
les
and
lois
provincial
fédérales
laws,
et
all
provinciales,
incarcerated
et puis
people
les
in
personnes
Canada have
incarcérées au
access to
Canada
a basic
ont
formal
accès à une
education up to
éducation
grade
normale de
12.
base
There are
qui leur
also several
permet
non-formal education programs that are
faire
available in
l'éducation
all
non formelle qui sont
institutions.
disponibles dans
There
toutes
are
les
also
institutions. Il
programs,
y a aussi des
as we will
programmes qu'on
see,
verra
that
qui
are
sont
specifically dedicated to
pour les
Aboriginal
personnes
people.
autochtones. Dans son rapport 2019
In its
et
2019
2020,
and
le Bureau de
2020
l'enquêteur
report,
correctionnel
the
du
Office
Canada
of the
mentionnait
Correctional
plusieurs statistiques
Investigator of Canada
alarmantes sur
devoted a
l'éducation
special
en
section to
prison
learning in
et
federal
relevait
prisons
plusieurs
and
défis
noted several
importants.
significant challenges.
Premièrement, le Service correctionnel du
First, the
Canada
Correctional Service
consacre
of
que 2 à
Canada,
3
which
de son budget à la
devotes only
formation des
2 to
personnes
3%
incarcérées, que
of
ce
its
soit en
budget to the
employabilité
training
ou
of
en éducation
incarcerated
formelle de
people,
base,
whether in
en fait préparation à
employability
la
or
formation
basic formal
d'éducation.
education.
Il
In
y a aussi un
fact,
grave
it is
manque
difficult to
d'accès à la
meet the
technologie
demand for
informatique de
education.
base et à
There
Internet,
is
qui
also a
nuit
severe
gravement
lack of access to
à la
basic
réussite scolaire
computer
et à la préparation
technology and the Internet, which
Donc,
are
les anecdotes
seriously
vont très
detrimental.
souvent pour
One of the
illustrer
anecdotes
ce
often
problème
quoted to
de
illustrate
manque
this
d'accès à la
problem or this
technologie.
lack of
C'est
access to
une diskette,
technology is a
comme
floppy
certains
disk.
d'entre
As
vous
some
ont
of you have,
déjà
I've probably
sans doute
worked
travaillé
with
avec
this
ça dans les
before
années
in the 80s,
80 ou
90s.
90.
But it
Mais il
turns
faut
out that
que cette diskette
incarcerated
historique
people who
doive
have to
sauvegarder le
save their
travail,
work that
travaux
they do
qui
on the
font ensuite
computer
le
have to
développement de
do it
cette
on these
diskette, ce qui donne
diskettes,
une idée
which gives you
du
an
niveau
idea of the level
d'accès à
of
la
access
technologie
to
dans les
technology in
pénitenciers.
federal penitentiaries.
Et plus généralement,
And more
et puis là
generally.
on se
And
rapproche du
then there
sujet
we
qui nous
approach
occupe
the
aujourd'hui,
subject that concerns us
plus
today.
généralement, donc
More
le Service
generally,
correctionnel
therefore,
canadien
the
fait
Canadian
face
Correctional
depuis
Service has
plusieurs
been
années à de
facing
graves
serious
problèmes de
problems of
surreprésentation
overrepresentation
des
of the
personnes
various
autochtones
Aboriginal
au sein du Canada.
populations in Canada for several
En effet,
years.
alors qu'il représente environ
Indeed,
seulement
while it
5% de la population
represents only
autochtone
about
canadienne, les personnes
5% of
d'origine
the general
autochtone
Canadian
constituent depuis
population,
2020
people of
30% de la
Aboriginal
population
origin
carcérale.
constitute
Les
since
femmes autochtones
2020
constituent quant à elles
30% of the
près de
prison
50% des
population.
personnes incarcérées
Aboriginal
sous
women make up
détention
nearly
fédérale.
50% of
Ces
federally
faits
incarcerated persons.
sont similaires
These facts are more or less
ailleurs dans le
similar when we
provincial
look at the
aussi.
provincial level as well.
Therefore, between 2011 and 2021, the proportion of incarcerated persons who are Inuit, Métis or First Nations and increase from 20 to 27% of the total incarcerated population in the same way. 43% of women incarcerated in federal institutions are Aboriginal. Then the growth curve continues to steepen. That was in 2021, so in 2022 we were at 50%, so we really see that the curves are ascending and they are very, very steep. More recently, on February 9, 2023, Commissioner Ann Kelly announced to the Standing Committee on Public Accounts of the Government of Canada that Indigenous offenders had represented 35% of new admissions to SC in 2022. As I recall, it represents only 5% population. According to an article that was published in 2000, I don't remember the details, but we will see according to this article do something and the worldly. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in Canada is a problem similar to what exists in the United States for the African American population. Often, the overrepresentation of African Americans in the United States prison system is cited as one of the most glaring problems, but when we look at the facts, we realize that the situation of Aboriginal people in Canada is similar, if not worse. Indeed, in the United States, in 2010, African Americans had a 6-point incarceration rate 7 times higher than Caucasians, while in Canada, at the federal level, Natives represented a 6-point incarceration rate, 2 times higher than used. Aboriginals are also vastly overrepresented in data on violent offenses and victimization, so Aboriginals in general are much more likely to have been victims of an act of violence, especially the most violent acts. According to an artist from Boshi, Taylor Boots, and Johnson, Natives in Canada are 7 to 8 times more likely to be victims of homicide than the general population, and between 1997 and 2000, Natives were 10 times more likely than non-Natives to be perpetrators presumed domicile. Unfortunately, there is something like a relationship of mistrust between the Canadian Correctional Service and Aboriginal people. Indeed, in the context of a difficult historical relationship between the Canadian prison system and the Aboriginal population and a clear success gap for this population in reducing risks, breaches of conditions and their social reintegration, we see that the importance of having services that are culturally appropriate, or at least that take into consideration the reality of Aboriginal peoples, is becoming increasingly evident. And in 2020, the Canadian Correctional Service was precisely recognizing the existence of something like systemic racism in its mode of operation, which put forward, and therefore the C. To respond to this situation, put forward a framework of action that included training to counter these systemic obstacles precisely within its organization. He wanted to adapt the services offered to people from visible and mobilized minorities, and raise awareness among external stakeholders of these issues. And the plan included a set of services to adapt to attitudes to promote the social integration of Aboriginal people.
This strategy includes the implementation of an integrated correctional program model for Aboriginal offenders, known as the MCA, which is in principle adapted to the specific needs of Aboriginals. These programs include weekly ceremonies, culturally appropriate materials and the involvement of elders in the process. In the correctional plan, incarcerated Aboriginal people. Programs are offered in discussion circles that take into account social backgrounds, such as the culture shock of incarceration, the residential school experience as well as the social disorganization of communities. The objective of these programs is for Aboriginal offenders to reconnect with their culture and integrate pro-social behaviors in accordance with traditional expectations. All Aboriginal offenders who are at moderate to high risk of recidivism should follow. The MCI has and should also be noted that non-Aboriginal offenders who have adopted Aboriginal cultural traditions for themselves, can follow these programs. There is also an integrated correctional program for the Inuit. The program is much the same as the MC has for male offenders and offers a holistic, comprehensive and integrated approach with elders, as well as a few differences, including being culturally Inuit-friendly, to recognize the uniqueness of the Inuit experience and to provide ceremonies that are culturally appropriate to the Inuit culture. The programs also take into account the same social background mentioned above. And these programs are modulated in intensity according to the type of crime, whether sexual or not, and according to the risk of recidivism, which is moderate, and therefore the number of sessions and the type of supervision will differ according to the profile of the person who is under it, and all Inuit offenders who have a moderate to high risk must participate in the CP.
We have the local oral, and therefore together what we see is that all the correctional services offered to Aboriginal people should in principle reflect their culture or their socio-cultural reality. This is why we are talking here about the empowerment and/or individualization of services, which is in principle a good practice. At least, that's what it is, what we believe. However, many, including the Correctional Supervision Office itself, are very skeptical about the C's real ability to meet the needs of incarcerated Aboriginals. There are even some people who think that the Canadian prison system is nothing more or less than an extension of the Canadian colonial regime in India. Compensation for the programs would be neither more nor less than a colonial project, and we will see that Justin Trialt shows that these programs are appreciated by the incarcerated natives, which undoubtedly moderates somewhat the kind of ambient skepticism in relation to these programs. And so we will have the opportunity to discuss this further. And this introduction is, in fact, I give the floor to Professor McLeans, who will be able to better share her experience and knowledge on these systems, and I thank you for your attention.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this reflection of some thoughts regarding this Indigenous community reintegration. Here, I will propose to you, I think, I have about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to quickly offer you an introduction where I'm going to essentially perhaps situate my work, what I have been working on, but basically my intervention comprises 33 parts. I want to come back to the term reintegration or community reintegration. I have a few comments to make. In relation to this, I will then quickly present the means that are mobilized for this community reintegration by the public authorities, by the correctional services, and from there, I will make a few observations. To then quickly conclude on these few lines of thought. So there you go. I would say that quickly there in the introduction, as we have pointed out, I am rooted in criminology, and I have essentially worked on the interactions between the first peoples and the system, the penal system, mainly in Quebec. So I work on these questions. Since 1984, I have specialized in the issue of alternatives. Anything to do with mediation, restorative justice, and I define myself more as a specialist in criminology, but who is more of a generalist on issues that affect the interface between Aboriginals and the penal system. I would also like to point out in this regard that I did not specifically work on these questions of Aboriginal community reintegration, except in 2007, 2010, when I did. I obtained a research grant to work on spirituality and healing programs in penitentiaries in Quebec. This is a research that was funded by the federal government through a granting agency.
But so the correctional services stopped our road, and we were unable to conduct interviews, and the opacity of the prison system is rather worrying. So I will start by a few thoughts about the theme of reintegrating the community reinsertion. So if we take the definition, but I propose a definition that's has been proposed by an association in Quebec that's called the rehabilitation, social rehabilitation in Quebec. This here it is what they propose as they describe the process as adaptation, individualized adaptation, multidimensional, long-term, and that's only achieved when the person reintegrated participates in the whole of social life and the community where she evolves, and that she has developed a feeling of belonging. So from then on, we can ask ourselves in what community reintegration is it really appropriated? Because if we apply this term to nation or communities who structurally and historically have been marginalized by the colonization process and its effect, and which are still actually present, even if we might have entered a phase where we was trying to get out of this, but I think that we're still very much in this colonization. So here, the question that we can ask ourselves is when we work, especially in prison system, in the community reintegration, taking into account this condition, structural condition, are we actually trying to reintegrate the individuals to a margin, a social margin? So I was wondering if it would be more appropriate, instead of talking to reintegration, is talking maybe about reconstruction of people instead of community reintegration. And the second point I would like to underline regarding this is that when we talk about marginalization, there is effectively a different level, and I would even an accumulation of marginalization, because we have to remember that Indigenous community themselves produce social inclusion. For example, the women victimized, who often are ostracized, excluded within community, and sometimes they have to leave the community. There are more and more a phenomenon of homelessness, and not just in urban situation. There's also a stigmatization of people who are delinquent. They are actually banishing requests that are more and more frequent in the camp ban council, that are actually requested on a traditional base of how we manage conflicts. So it is a problem with the reintegration, because this level of association, it's a complex topic, and we don't have to take for granted that the community is a natural space of reintegration. So that was my second point that I wanted to mention regarding this. So there's a certain complexity. My third point is about the community. What do we mean about that? I don't want here enter the debate about the sense, the meaning we could do because it's not necessarily very evident, obvious to define a community, the notion of community, but also we have to, when we talk about community, we have a tendency to talk about indigenous communities, but they are also former prisoners, inmates that would return to city or to their community. So, and my last point would be for me, when we talk about the community reintegration, we have two faces of the same mirror or two prisms, because we have to consider the question of reintegration in a community means both the theme or the issue of going back to a community, reintegrated, or but there's also mobilize a community to work towards a community reintegration. And correctional services actually are starting to work on these two prisms. So that was my first point. My second point was very quickly, I would like, without repeating what Frederick mentioned, I would like to present the means that are mobilized to do actually this community reintegration. So in Quebec, we have resourcing pavilions. So these are establishments that are really conceived, designed for Indigenous people, and the proposed programs, activities that I really founded on spirituality, tradition, etc. So it goes back to a very large notion of education. We talk more about Indigenous teaching. So just wanted to mention that in Canada, we have 10 pavilions of this kind that are either managed by correctional services or by community. So there are four actually pavilions that are being managed by correctional services. There are programs of spirituality, healing. There's also, let's underline it, we have community centers. There are more transitional centers between the detention and liberation. And the last mean that we can identify is the Indigenous liaison agents that are being hired by the correctional services and that are working to, and they offer them counseling services, and they also try to make a link between the detention and the Indigenous collectivity community. So I want, overall, I really want to concentrate on findings, and these are the few findings that I would like to put on the table. The first is the correctional surrounding, that's provincial. There's no specific program for Indigenous inmates. There's nothing specifically designed for them. And then even less than nothing for young people who are also in detention, even though they overrepresented in the system. And the other, and this is my major problem, is the problem of accessibility to these programs, especially the resourcing pavilions. They have a good evaluation. There are lots of research that can show the benefits in terms of reconstruction for people who beneficiate from that. But the major problem about that, it's good to have a program like this, but when these programs are not very accessible, especially noticeably for reason of security quote, because the system here works in the more the security are maximum, the security code are maximum or average, and the more it becomes difficult to have access to these resources. In exact, for example, the resourcing pavilions. And Indigenous are overquoted in terms of security, and paradoxically, they have even less access to these pavilions, which is a complete paradox because the needs for this time of program for Indigenous people are even more important for average population. So the correctional system functions on this ideology of risk management, which is very discriminating for Indigenous delinquents. So, and also the availability of these resources, and I'm looking forward to hearing about Justin, because in the other system is it seems more accessible, but in Quebec we have really low access to that. The links with the communities are not very well developed, so the liaison agent Indigenous are not very present in the Quebec landscape. And the other problem is also the resources are very limited in terms of resource HR structure. And that also goes back to the point that I was underlining earlier, is that working to community reinsertion with communities that are themselves, with communities that are themselves marginalized, it's very difficult to work to, so these communities have marginalized themselves, they have very few resources, so it's even more difficult. I work in Nunavik, with the north of Quebec, with the Inuit. There's never a welcome structure for former inmates that would come in the community. However, it would be something rather simple to put into place. And also there's a problem of resistance for people coming back, people who have been liberating and who come back into the community, and there's a resistance. We can't minimize that problem. I worked a little bit in Quebec. I work on standardization for that offers a certain standardized cultural tools that don't necessarily correspond to cultural diversity. Let's remember that in Quebec we have 11 nations, so we have very few things, for example, for Inuit, like the medicine wheel that's largely used in the correctional system, doesn't correspond in any way for the Inuit, to the Inuit culture. The other problem is that we had scandals concerning the elders' status that are being hired by the correctional services in 2019 in 18 elders that were working in the penitentiaries, federal penitentiaries, 7 did not belong to any recognized Indigenous tribe. So, and there are lots of Indigenous who tell us that a lot of elders that have been hired by the correctional services are not being recognized in their own community as elders. So also in Quebec, where we have some move towards this self-proclamation of Indigenous identity by inmates. So, which makes sense that in Quebec, we have non-Indigenous people who would identify themselves as Indigenous people to be able to follow this program, who would allow more freedom in under certain conditions. Let's say. So I will end with there's a difference and a shock between the strong cultural connection that inmates can live through this program when they have access to them. So there's a very strong cultural connection in an institution, and then when they get out, they are confronted to a kind of void, because in communities or urban communities, this cultural connection also is that connection, and this is also one of the effects of colonialism. This connection is really a lot less strong, and that shock would cause a lot of problems when the inmates get out of detention. And I will finish by, in spite of these programs, we we can see that we find that there's not the population, the Indigenous population does not diminish in the prison population in spite of these programs. So I would like to, the first point I would like to finish with is like the overrepresentation, severe overrepresentation of Indigenous people does not mean that these programs are bad or useless. On the contrary, the results are very positive. But the problem, in my opinion, is that they are being used in a correctional penal logic, and that are maintained, and they're not deconstructed. So we end up using programs that are constructive in an institution, in an institution that remains, in my eyes, in a colonial that keeps working with notion of risk management uh, that really doesn't go at all with the Indigenous conception of justice. So that's the essential problem that of essential problem of these programs. These are a good program, but they still function with a logic that doesn't correspond. And also these programs, as positive they would be, don't allow to eliminate the program of effect that participate to the exclusion of people who come from the penal system, because by the functioning, the ideology values participate to the exclusion to people, and that will put into place research system, but without taking account the effect of that very same system produces. So we kind of a loop. So as a conclusion, this penal system doesn't manage delinquent population. They manage social problems, and they criminalize social problems. And as long as we don't act in parallel on social problem, then the correctional problem, in my opinion, will not have an impact. So we have to, it's imperative to work beforehand on the social problems. And the other point that I think that what we should be able to do is develop these initiatives, but completely emancipated of the penal logic, penal like correctional logic. For me, the situation would be to develop as much as possible pavilion of resourcing pavilion without this penal and correctional logic that would work on two main principles: security of people and collectivity, but also reparation or healing of people and collectivities. So for me, the community reintegration is not, for Indigenous, is not possible without reconstructing the community. So it goes through, it has to go through community reconstruction and a reconstruction of social regulation and work as much as possible ahead of time and abolish prison and substituting to resourcing a pavilion when we can't do anything else, when there's, for example, security concerns. So these are a few thoughts about social and community reintegration. Thank you very much, Mylène. So Jason Tetro, a little note before
just before I give you the floor, Justin, I just want to remind everyone that they can pose or ask questions using the Q&R module by the Zoom application. So don't hesitate to ask your question. N'hésitez pas à poser vos questions directement au fur et à mesure de la présentation. Ça nous facilite la vie puisqu'on peut les colliger et ensuite les poser à nos panélistes. So Justin, the floor is yours. Merci encore à Mylène et go ahead.
Great, thanks so much, Frederick. I'm going to share my screen here. That looks good. Okay, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to the organizers for having me today. I really appreciate you including me in this conversation. Unfortunately, I missed the first 10 minutes or so of Mylène's talk as I didn't know about the translation option, but based on what I did catch, I think there's a lot of overlap with our findings, and I agree with Mylène's conclusions about penal logic and addressing broader social problems. This comes up a lot in our work too, as you'll see. Yeah, so my name's Justin. I live in Alberta, Canada, Treaty 6. I'm also Red River Métis or Indigenous. And I'm just going to jump right in because there's a lot to cover. So I'm talking about indigenizing prisons, which in a nutshell refers to cultural programming. Some of this has been covered already. And Canada has been at the forefront of developing these initiatives. However, indigenizing prisons is a controversial practice, which I'll discuss in a moment. And really, this talk is about what do Indigenous peoples think about indigenized programming, incarcerated Indigenous peoples think about these programs, and what are the implications of these programs for community reentry. And I'm arguing that we ought to think of these cultural accommodations in prison as a fundamental human right. So all of the data I'm covering comes from the University of Alberta Prison Project, where I'm part of a bigger team. We've been inside 6 prisons so far in Western Canada, where at the time we interviewed almost 600 incarcerated men and women, with roughly 40% of those people identifying as Indigenous. Many participants also lived on reserves, had been impacted by residential schools and the foster system. But before I keep going, I should probably explain what all of this is, the kind of situation in Canada and our colonial history. Canada is so some of this has been covered already, but just to emphasize a few things, Canada is a settler colonial state, and 5% of Canada's population is Indigenous, yet Indigenous peoples make up 30% of prison admissions in Canada, and their rate of incarceration, which I think has been mentioned, has increased 43% over the last decade. The situation is even worse for Indigenous women, where they now make up half of federal prison admissions for women. And as I have on the slide here, these disparities are even higher in the prairie provinces where we did our research, with Indigenous peoples making upwards of 40 to 75% of the population, depending on the prison. So why are Indigenous peoples so vastly overrepresented? I don't have time to cover everything here, but Canada has a long history of colonial policies designed to destroy Indigenous cultures, which today we call cultural genocide. So there are many overtly racist policies that I can point to, but I'll cover some of the bigger ones that are relevant to our study. I'm sure some people have heard of Indian reserves, where in Canada, early policies forcibly relocated Indigenous peoples into these spaces. Canada's reserve system was a textbook example of racial segregation that, for instance, greatly influenced South African apartheid. Canadian policymakers met with and helped the architects of apartheid. The average reserve has a population of roughly 500 people, some much more than that, some much less. Most reserves are below the poverty line, and many do not have clean water. You may have also heard about Canada's Indian residential school system, which recently received international coverage because they discovered various mass grave sites of children at these locations. What is an Indian residential school? Well, it's when the Canadian government forced children into classrooms to be assimilated, essentially taught by the church to become westernized, to become Christian, essentially white, in order to, again, destroy Native culture. This system lasted until 1996. In these schools, thousands of children died, typically due to disease from poor living conditions and malnourishment. There are also well-documented instances of physical and sexual abuse by the church staff who ran the schools. You see some of them in the pictures here. The Pope delivered a formal apology for residential schools actually just last year at Musqueam Reserve, which is about 50 minutes from where I am. And as you might suspect, the apology was very controversial. The last one I'll mention, the last colonial policy I'll mention here is the 60 scoop, where the Canadian government gave sweeping powers and incentives to child services to scoop Indigenous kids from their homes and put them up for adoption with typically white families in order to assimilate them as part of the assimilation project. And sometimes they would change the children's names so that the biological families couldn't find them. And what you see here are advertisements of the period trying to give the children away to families. And so this happened to my father and his family, my aunts and uncles. They separated his brothers and sisters across the country. And I don't know most of my paternal family. As one example, one of my aunts was relocated to a remote northern community and forced to look after a bunch of kids, and later ended her life. So the forced labor of scoop children was pretty common. And so we're still dealing with the legacy of the 60 scoop today, as over half of children in Canada, Canada's foster system, are Indigenous, despite making up 7% of the population of children. So what does all of this have to do with crime in prisons? Well, these policies I mentioned devastated entire communities, leading to much higher rates of poverty. They separated and destroyed families, which has led to a mental health crisis in communities. And all of these policies together, as well as Canada's punitive, tough on crime policies, have led to the current situation where, again, almost half of Indigenous people in prison are Indigenous, despite representing only 5% of our population. So mass incarceration is obviously an issue in Canada, and the government has responded in a variety of ways. To be clear, none of them are sufficient, but there have been changes. And so today I'm interested in indigenizing prisons. What is indigenizing prisons? I'll unpack that in a second, but you can understand it for now just as cultural programming inside of prisons. And these programs are controversial, to say the least, where many experts consider cultural programming to be advancing Canadian colonialism. Some call these programs genocidal. And I don't want to spend too much time on the controversy because there's lots to get to, but this opposition to indigenized programming, you could say, became popularized around 2015 or 16, arguably with this McLeans article. McLeans is kind of like Canada's Time magazine, and it's a pretty good piece actually about mass incarceration, and it's really just in the title. The author states that Canadian prisons are like the new residential schools in how colonial and how oppressive they are. And my sense is that, the title was meant to be provocative, get readers interested. But what are the experts saying? Well, academic conversations, by and large, on indigenizing prisons tends to be dominated by prison abolitionists, sometimes called critical prison studies. And not all, but most of these writers on the topic make the same argument that indigenizing prisons is kind of the new form of residential schools. In other words, from their perspective, these initiatives are basically colonial state education, where the program instructor kind of forces a literally captive audience to adopt an Indigenous identity in a top-down way in a classroom setting. And so for these critics, indigenizing prisons only improves colonialism. It makes colonialism better. It makes it more efficient. And altogether, from their perspective, these programs are doing little more than continuing or improving cultural genocide. Again, this idea that prisons and their programs are the new residential schools. And on the face of it, if you just take that argument at face value, there's something maybe appealing about those arguments. It's a nice, clean narrative. It seems logical and consistent about what's happening. The question, of course, is this actually what's happening with these programs and indigenizing prisons? What's the problem with these critiques? The issue with this opposition to indigenizing prisons is that by and large, most critics, almost all of them, do not include the opinions of incarcerated Indigenous peoples or communities. Contemporary arguments against indigenized programming are based foremost on abolitionist theory. Meanwhile, the empirical work engaging with Indigenous peoples and communities show that Indigenous peoples want these programs despite their many flaws and limitations. You know, we know these programs are not perfect. Furthermore, in Canada, we've also had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC. We've also had a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and based on thousands of interviews and anecdotes, both of these reports explicitly say we want more indigenized prison programming. Moreover, indigenizing prisons was born out of resistance by incarcerated Indigenous men and women, as historian Seth Adima and others have documented. This, of course, doesn't mean that we don't critique these programs, but we certainly can't dismiss them as simply a new type of genocide, as some experts have done. And so building on this with our study, my argument in a nutshell is that rather than just assuming that indigenizing prisons advances genocide, we should listen to what Indigenous peoples are saying, and we should think of indigenized programming as a fundamental human right. With our study, the TRC and the National Inquiry say that Indigenous peoples want more cultural programming, but these reports don't get into much detail as to why this is important for people in prison, and our study helps explain why people want these programs. So what are our findings? The first thing to talk about is, what is indigenizing prisons exactly? What are these programs? Because what became kind of clear writing this piece is that we don't really know how these programs work in practice or how often incarcerated people can access them. So part of our findings was just kind of making sense of what all these programs look like in practice on the ground. So what are these programs? Number one here is the classroom setting, where you have courses that incarcerated people can enroll in, and the instructors teach prisoners about Indigenous cultures and history. These programs also try to help incarcerated people think about how their trauma or their drug use or their criminalized behaviors are directly connected to Canada's colonial policies, the earlier ones that I mentioned. Second, indigenized programming also just includes staff facilitating spiritual ceremonies, including drumming, singing, group prayer, etc. The next one is elder visits. Basically, elders come in from the community, or they are hired by the prisons to act as elders, to interact with prisoners, give advice, serve as a bit of a therapeutic role, in the same way you might have a Christian pastor come in to the prison and interact with folks. And the last one here is healing lodges. Basically, these are prisons designed around indigenization with all of the preceding programming, and those are meant for typically lower security prisoners who are almost ready to return to the community. Some healing lodges are managed by Indigenous communities or organizations. And so the next question is, what did our participants think about these programs? So I'm going to go through these one by one and unpack them, but these are the positive impressions. Then I'll talk about the criticisms. Number one, the programs taught incarcerated Indigenous peoples their history and culture for the first time, many of them anyway. Help them feel empowered and prideful about their culture and heritage. 3, help participants cope with colonial traumas. 4, can create a support network between elders and fellow prisoners rather than being this coercive and top-down institution. And 5, is necessary to basic religious accommodation in prison. So what did our participants say exactly? Number 1, programs taught participants their history and culture for the first time. So I'll be talking about difficult topics here, including sexual violence and child abuse. This is Irene. She is a 30-year-old Indigenous woman who spent most of her life in and out of group homes and treatment centers when she was not imprisoned. She was sexually abused as a child, and both of her parents attended residential schools. Irene's life story was pretty common among our sample of women. She says, I wasn't aware of much of my Indigenous history. I've only learned about all that this past year through the new incorporated programs here. And she proceeds to say how she began to realize through these prison programs how much her past traumas, including her parents' traumas from residential schools, impacted her life, helped her contextualize her family struggles and struggles in her community. Another example, this is Samantha, who grew up on a poor reserve affected by the opioid crisis that began around 2016. Most of her eldest families attended residential schools, and she contrasts her experience with programming in the prison against how residential schools attempted and failed to assimilate her grandparents. And so she's basically saying there's a difference between residential schools that attempted to destroy and silence their cultures compared to these programs that encourage them to express and engage in their cultures. The second big finding with positive impressions is that these programs help participants feel empowered and prideful about their culture and heritage, kind of related to the last point. But this is Nathan. He's a 34-year-old Vietnamese Cree man that lived in multiple foster homes where he was physically and sexually abused throughout his childhood. Some foster parents threatened Nathan with violence to tell others he was white, a pretty common experience in our participants' experiences in the foster system. And so he outlines how Indigenized programming helped him become proud of his Indigenous identity and encouraged him to think about how his past trauma affected how he thinks of himself and his identity today. And the thing to keep in mind with a lot of this is that many Indigenous peoples don't know their cultural background because they were victims of the scoop, removed from their families. Related to this, programming helped participants cope with traumas, including residential school and foster experiences. We interviewed some residential school survivors who were older folks. This is Chester. He is a 51-year-old Cree man who attended residential schools during the mid-70s. And he explains how access to sweetgrass helps him cope with his trauma from that experience. He says the sweetgrass they provide in the prison helps him with his trauma from the schools. And he says, my past kind of overwhelms me sometimes, but I'm looking forward to the pipe ceremony next Wednesday. So they facilitate ceremonies on the living unit. So access to ceremonial materials on the unit can help Indigenous peoples work through or manage their trauma. The fourth one, programming creates support networks between elders and fellow prisoners rather than being coercive and top-down. So instead of being this forced institution, the folks we interviewed explained how they want help. They desire help and encouragement. Encouragement is important too, for improving their mental and physical health and overall well-being. And many Indigenous prisoners viewed drug rehabilitation or getting clean as an essential part of their healing journey, as they would often call it, their healing journey. This is Clayton. He is a federally sentenced Ojibwe man, also a victim of extreme violence as a child, and he explains how the programs helped him with his trauma and learn about his history and how he had a kind of informal support network to help with his confidence. This next slide is a little difficult. For our study, the most victimized or marginalized people in our sample, who are typically Indigenous, found the most value in programming's rehabilitative or therapeutic elements. Jamie is a 20-year-old Indigenous woman who has been homeless since she was 14 after running away from a group home where she was sexually abused, so she ran away and became homeless. When we asked her about programming, she responded, programming, right now I'm thinking they're all going to be useful. I literally haven't learned anything in my whole life. I've done it all on my own. So, basically saying I've never been taught anything in my life. For the most vulnerable men and women like Jamie, Indigenized programming is essential for developing confidence, as many incarcerated people struggle with self-worth related to childhood trauma, especially Indigenous women. And like Jamie, many participants just did not have support networks throughout their lives. And then coming into the prison, they have this informal support network with other prisoners, elders, sometimes staff, and the programs try to create those networks. So the programming is more fluid than simply like a classroom. It's more, involves more fluid processes. And then the last finding here for positive impressions, number 5, is that Indigenized programming is necessary to basic religious accommodation in prison. Under the Canadian Charter, prisons are required to meet a prisoner's religious needs. And for Indigenous peoples, religion and culture Religion and culture are mostly inseparable. This idea that spirituality and culture are separate is basically a Western or colonial invention. And what I'm getting at is because culture and spirituality are the same thing for many Indigenous peoples, if not most, we can think of cultural programming as a religious rite. Criticisms. The last part for the data are criticisms that our participants had of the programming, and their criticisms did not focus at all on the content of the programs, but rather accessing the programs. We'll unpack these, but just quickly, one criticism was access to indigenized programming is greatly inconsistent for medium and high security prisoners, and second, staff prejudice or racism can prevent access to programming. So what are we talking about here? Number one, access to indigenized programming is greatly inconsistent. In short, the great majority of incarcerated people who are usually medium or high security have inconsistent or no access to everything I just outlined, all the resources I just described. So what's happening here? At almost every step, staff can turn down requests for programming based on security reasons, such as saying that prisoners will turn ceremonial materials into weapons or that sort of thing. But the big one people talked about in our interviews was unit lockdowns. Unit lockdowns are where prison units are punished, the prisoners are punished, and prisoners are not allowed out of their cells for an extended period of time. And when lockdowns happen, programming is suspended. So during the time we interviewed Chester here, correctional officers punished his living unit with a week-long lockdown, which suspended courses, suspended elder visits, suspended access to ceremonial materials. So he says here, I went through a lot in residential schools, and being in here during the lockdown is kind of like, wow, not being able to use sweetgrass or the drum triggers memories all the time because residential schools took away everything from us. So basically, Chester is explaining how being denied access to ceremonial materials triggers traumatic memories of residential schools, because for him, spiritual practices are a normal part of his life and identity. So for folks like Chester, restricting programming can be really bad for mental health. Another big criticism was staff prejudice and racism. Accessing most indigenized programming is highly and sometimes entirely dependent on staff because the staff control movement and they control materials. Staff give prisoners access to ceremonial items and they have to supervise things like prayers or drum circles. So without staff support, Indigenous programming is often impossible. Rory here explains how some staff disrespect Indigenous culture and do not facilitate ceremonies, denying them their right to religious accommodation. And Rory says at the bottom in here, practicing our culture in prison is considered a privilege. And again, I'm encouraging us to think about these practices as a fundamental human right. So those were our major findings concerning indigenizing prisons. One last finding to discuss, this is just a summary of the criticisms. One last finding to discuss before I wrap up here as we think about reintegration, and this is from colleagues of mine using the same data set, prison as a temporary refuge. So one of the most tragic findings of our work in prisons is that many of the most marginalized people in our sample, who are typically Indigenous, express that prison was a place of refuge from their life outside or their life on the streets. So some examples for them, prison was a place where they could potentially sleep relatively safely for the first time in a long time, because as they told us, shelters are not necessarily safe. People also use prison to escape the cold. The Canadian prairies get as cold as -40 every year. And when that happens, frankly, people die in the streets. Prison served as a place where some participants could escape their abusive partners. For others in prison, they could get meals on a regular basis, or they could try to get clean from the potentially lethal drugs they were using on the street. Others found that the medical and dental attention in the prison was more accessible for them than on the outside. And to be clear, the prison healthcare is really bad. For some, they didn't have to worry about where they would sleep at night or what their next meal would be. And so they were finally mentally prepared to attend to their medical needs. And this is certainly not us saying that prison is a good place to be. Rather, what this speaks to is how other institutions in society, such as schools, police, child services, the courts, shelters, medical and counseling services, and altogether the government have so dramatically failed these people. And so to wrap up on the implications for reintegration, we are continuing this work under a partnership grant investigating reentry over the next 7 years. And in short, we're going to interview incarcerated people that are about to be released and then interview them again on the outside about their reintegration experience, which comes with all sorts of complications. Much of what we know about reentry in like criminology, academia, comes from the United States, and our context is pretty different, particularly in relation to Indigenous peoples. And so these are some questions we're asking related to the themes I've discussed. Why is it that some people see prison as a refuge? How can we unpack this? How can we address this? Does cultural programming extend into the community? Many people connect to their culture inside the prison. Can they continue that and continue healing in that way when they get out? The next one, how do released people find support? Talking to people working in this area, just preliminary findings, a big problem, it seems, is that supports do exist, but a huge obstacle is released people might not know about them, or if they do know about them, they can't access them or get to them. Sometimes it could be as simple as transportation. How can social services improve and increase collaboration? This is another problem related to the previous point, where there doesn't seem to be much communication between social services. It appears to be quite siloed, where we know that many released people need all of these services, but these organizations don't necessarily collaborate. Are social services culturally informed? So for example, can release programming attend to the unique needs of a person living on a reserve or returning to a reserve? I don't have the answer to that question, but that's something we're going to be looking at. And finally, how can we give power to Indigenous communities for supporting reentry? In short, we've seen how important Indigenized programming is for people inside the prison. So we need to see Indigenous groups get more control of programming that happens outside of the prison. Indigenous peoples know what's best for Indigenous peoples. The final thing to emphasize again with our study is the unique context of the Canadian prairies, which affects pretty much everything. The first one I've mentioned, we have over 3,000 reserves in the country, and a significant portion of our participants will be returning to those communities. To compare, the USA just has, I don't want to say just has, but has just over 300 reserves. So we have 10 times more than that. The next one is the geography of Canada. So Canada is massive, the second biggest landmass in the world, and cities and towns tend to be pretty far apart, which will pose challenges to us logistically. And the weather, of course, is another thing to emphasize, where it gets -40 outside. Our findings could be completely different for people released in the winter months because of how cold it gets here. And the last one, we are also going through a drug poisoning crisis, especially around fentanyl and meth, which affects marginalized people the most and can lead to lethal overdoses. The drug trade is often run by gangs, which are sometimes part of life in certain communities, where people's entire families can be involved. For our original study, before the pandemic, gang members were happy to be interviewed. We interviewed many of them, though we do anticipate a much greater challenge for studying gang member reintegration or people returning to communities with high gang involvement. So there's lots more to say, and I can't cover it all, but altogether, Indigenized programming, to be clear, is obviously not a solution to all of these issues that I've identified. It's not a solution to mass incarceration. We should continue critiquing these programs. However, we can't just dismiss them completely. And if it's not clear, we don't just stop at cultural programming. These programs are a very, very small part of a bigger picture, and when led by Indigenous peoples, can have the potential for realizing and developing more radical changes, such as safe decarceration, safe release, which should always be the priority. And again, Indigenized programs are a fundamental human right that should extend into reintegration. So I hope this talk has helped show how Indigenized programs, while flawed, they can help people. And right now we need to give Indigenous peoples more power over these initiatives, because as I hope I've shown, just how important cultural programming is for helping people to heal and for realizing safe reintegration. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks so much, everyone, for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, Justin, for a very interesting and very very well presented
Merci.
talk. I'm sure a lot of people really appreciated the visual aid that you provide us. And Mylène, tu peux ouvrir ta caméra? Si tu le veux bien.
Mylène, you can open your camera if
Donc,
you want
je vais poser une question. I'll pose it in English just so Justin understands. Just to perhaps clear the air a little bit about data and numbers. A member of the audience asked, to my mind, a good question about the relationship between self identification and the problem of overrepresentation. Are we seeing numbers that involve people who self identify as Indigenous as part of the quote unquote overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the carceral system, to your knowledge?
Sorry, is this for both of us?
It's for both. Oui, c'est pour les deux. Donc, Mylène, tu pourrais aussi intervenir sur cette question-là, si tu veux.
I guess I'll go first since I'm talking. So for our study, we used self-identification. There's really no other way we could have done it. And I mean, this is a big controversy. I'm not sure if this person's Canadian or not. This is a big controversy in the country, self-identifying. So as a Métis person, this is a huge controversy among the Métis community, where Métis, many people think just means you have an Indigenous ancestor, but Métis nations argue that actually self-identification is not enough. You have to be a descendant of the Red River Métis. So that's a big conversation that's going on. And I can't speak for other communities because there's hundreds of them, but this is a constant tension in you could say just in Indigenous life, and people self-identifying, and then later it comes out that they're not Indigenous is another issue. And so we didn't appear to see much of this in our study of people not being Indigenous and identifying Indigenous. I should also just emphasize that non-Indigenous peoples can participate in everything I just described in my talk. And non-Indigenous peoples can participate in smudging, they can participate in healing lodges, they can participate in elders and programming and go to the indigenized living units. This is not an Indigenous exclusive series of programs. These are for everybody. So I think that also helps people from not feeling like, okay, well, I'm not Indigenous, but I really want to go to the healing lodge because it's better over there, you know, from their perspective, and there's more programming over there. That's not the case. So there's no, as far as I can tell, at least in our study, there's no the urge for people to identify as Indigenous who are not. You know, it's really hard to tell. Even if that's the case, it's really hard to know from an academic perspective. But it's a really good question.
Okay. Mylène? Mylène, est-ce que tu voulais réagir à la question sur est-ce que ton micro est éteint?
Oui, voilà, c'est une bonne question.
That's a good question. I think right now we can say there's a self-proclamation that in detention, that's very clear, but we don't have data that would really demonstrate that it plays on the overrepresentation rates. So there's no study about that. So intuitively, I would say that's the margin is very small, but I can't really answer. There's no answer about that. But I can say, yes, actually, it does create attention, and it is a problem. So thank you. So we can agree that even though there's people who self-proclaim as members of First Nations, the numbers is the overrepresentation would be obvious in any way. But the portion that it plays, it wouldn't make it such as we would find a normal representation. That's very clear. The increase of the overrepresentation still subsists in any case. So also, I would like to repeat to the audience that you can keep asking questions by using the question answers function, and don't hesitate. We will answer your questions. A little question from Mylène directly. For Inuits, according to you, a prison that it is
Bon, c'est sûr que moi, je prône pas le développement d'établissements carcéraux.
integrating program specifically designed for them. I am completely opposed to the tendency to installing more prison, but however, so I think we need to get out of the carceral prison. But I am in favor of residential program, resourcing programs on their territory. So it's
next
an
question,
aberration.
I kind of want to perhaps link the two, not presentations, but sort of meta considerations that were implicit in both of your talks. That is the sort of ideological or theoretical positions that the way forward in improving reintegration or reconstruction of people's capacity to something like the abolition of
I'm sorry if I don't know if it's just on my end, but I couldn't understand what you were saying for some technical issue.
Okay, sorry about that. Frederick wanted to ask a question about the ideology positioning en contraste avec l'idéologie, dans le fond, de la prison versus la position un peu plus ouverte sur la question
prison
de la
ideology on about the de-incarceration
peut être une solution à des
what
problèmes adaptés. Donc, on voudrait vous entendre un peu
level
sur
the
decarceration
measure could be. I'm not certain it was the right question.
Commencer à répondre à cette question. Je comprends la position de Justin
answer to this question. I understand Justin's position,
parce que oui, ces programmes sont très bons, mais moi je réitère que le
lauded the programs, but I reiterate that the major problem is that we can't ignore the institution in which these programs are taking place, because in my opinion it's counterproductive, and I don't understand that we don't invest more in initiative ahead of penal, because we always come back to this. For me, it's completely, it's an aberration. Put a lot of energy on correctional services. Okay, they exist, so let's do what needs to be done to improve them, make them accessible and everything. But I'm afraid that we might not question enough the carceral prison system, because I'm sorry, even with a spiritual program, with resourcing pavilions, nevertheless, someone who went through that system lives discrimination, lives very negative effects to this passage, and that complicates a lot the exit and reintegration, and we can't ignore this. And that would be my critique in regards to Justin's position is like analyze these programs without inscribe them again in the frame, the institution that keeps on working with a logic of risk managing, of a system that produces exclusion by its very way of functioning and the judicial case and everything. So I know it's not the topic because we're talking about reintegration, but I don't understand about the poor parent that if we have to reform something and it's an emergency, it's the police. And the police is the institution on which there's a least reform. Everything we do is to see how we can solution the underfinancing. But for me, it's completely illogical to have tribunals in Canada which transformed in a way that, very interesting way, for example, with the Gladu report, which try to force the judges to see that impact with the Gladius report. So we know, Gladu says to the judges, please try to avoid incarceration when it comes to Indigenous people.
I think your audio is still distorted.
J'ai rien compris, mais
I did not understand.
Okay, on va y aller. Justin, could you add some reflections on the opposition between decarceration and adaptation of programs for Indigenous people?
Sorry, there's a little audio area issue here. Sorry, what was the question? I did hear McLean's response, but I'm just wondering what the question is.
Milan was thinking about the impact of the control. Okay, what was it? Ça marche.
Vous m'entendez? Okay. So I'm just gonna turn off my video, and my audio hopefully is going to be a bit better.
Yeah,
so the question posed was basically, how do we sort of reconcile the abolitionist outlook on prisons and the necessary improvement or the goodness of indigenized programs? And Milan was, I think, rightly pointing out that it's a bit disheartening to see that to focus on prison reforms when really the need is police reforms. So basically reforming all the problems before they actually get to prisons.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to respond to some of that, I don't think I've said anything about me saying that prison programming can help people is not the same thing as saying prisons are working, or it's not the same thing as saying that we shouldn't work to the abolition of prisons. The elders who developed and community members who developed indigenizing prisons from the ground up and incarcerate Indigenous peoples in the decades preceding the official integration of these programs were staunch abolitionists who hated the prison system, but they also saw the importance of working inside and helping incarcerated people live dignified lives. Elder Arthur Solomon was an Indigenous elder, and he worked inside the prison. He called the prison an abomination, a white racist institution, an evil empire, but he recognized the importance of helping people inside. And I think a lot of the abolitionist discourse today, not all of it, but at least the academic side of it, is completely dismissive of these programs, and frankly not listening to Indigenous peoples. And I should just emphasize again, the TRC and the National Inquiry call for improving these programs. They also call for decarceration, and I don't see any contradiction in helping people who need urgent help right now and working to decarcerate the system. And frankly, my philosophy is listening to Indigenous peoples, not to abolitionists. Many Indigenous peoples are abolitionists, and that's great. But I'm interested in what the TRC says, which has, as far as we can tell, it's not perfect, but has the biggest collection of Indigenous peoples opinions on what we should do. So I don't think there's any contradiction in being an abolitionist and working to help people inside. I'm not sure how we arrived at this moment where we think that's the case. I have a piece coming out that critiques a lot of these ideas. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and going through the abolitionist work. And I think you can be an abolitionist and call for better programs. I'm not sure. I never said anything like we shouldn't be decarcerating, and a little, concerned that that's what some people think of.
No, I don't think that's what came across at all. But and to reassure you, I don't think that's what came across at all. But there are basically this idea that I'm moving with my hands, so it's difficult to actually talk without my camera. But it's a question of priority that might have been. But I see how, Justin, you're basically saying there are people there, they have needs, and they ought to be respected and met. And I want to ask this following question about this idea of indigenization as a human right. Right, there are minimal standards that prisons ought to comply with per the UN Mandela rules, right, which involve a bunch of rules that prisons ought to respect minimally to respect the human rights of people who are incarcerated. But to my knowledge, it doesn't include any indigenous programming. It doesn't include any culturally sensitive programming as of yet. And to bring it back to this idea that people have a right to education in prison, do you think that by and large there is an argument to adapt any and all programming to people who identify as members of First Nations, insofar as this would perhaps respect their human right to education and so on and so forth? So should we basically, in short, should we change the curriculum in order to better help indigenous people who are incarcerated? Mylène, est-ce que tu voudrais réagir à cette question? Est-ce que mon son est toujours mauvais?
C'est mieux, c'est mieux.
C'est mieux. Mais en gros, je me posais la question parce que
so I was wondering, because Justin suggests that there would be like a fundamental human right to have this program adapted, but it's not the case right now. It's not in the official charts. So there's no specific right to have culturally adapted services. So one, what do you think of that? And two, if we connect it to more formal education, would Indigenous people in prison would have a right to a personalized, culturally adapted education. So I might be in a maybe. We have very few minutes left. So I think we have to get out of the adaptation logic. The plan is to go through self-determination, and from then the Indigenous themselves. So it's more the right to self-determination we should go look into. So if there was a disagreement between you, that would be a common ground. And yeah, oui, je pense que le droit, I can't hear them.
Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to follow the interpretation. Is the question, should we incorporate indigenization into official prison curriculum? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm asking, I'm sort of bringing it back bringing it back to the idea that that education in prison is a right. So as far as I know, culturally sensitive or culturally adapted programs is not a right, but should, like in the official documentations, should we think of adapting curriculums and formal education in prison for Indigenous people as a right, and how should we go about doing this?
Oh, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, my answer to this is always, I think McLean mentions right to self-determination is, central here. Give Indigenous peoples more power. So I guess my conclusion from all of this is that we need to give Indigenous peoples more power and control over these initiatives, and my sense is that that would involve kind of what you're asking for. I'm not really sure what else to say into a response to a lot of this, and that we kind of already know what Indigenous peoples, at least in Canada, want. I can't speak for all Indigenous peoples everywhere. It's fairly clear based on the empirical work and the TRC and the national inquiry, how we can help Indigenous peoples, and it outlines recommendations. So, I think that's what we need to listen to. I'm not here to, my challenge to a lot of the discourse out there, particularly some of the critical prison studies discourse, again, not all abolitionists, not all critical prison scholars are saying this. It's not just our study coming in and challenging what they're saying. This has been, the TRC has been out since 2015, and sections, I think 35, 36, and 37 call for improved programming. It also calls to decarcerate. So we can do both of those things at once. And the long and short of it is Indigenous people's right to self-determination is essential here. And prison programming is a part of that self-determination. And people need help now. And I'm not convinced that there's very obvious, clear alternatives that we can be doing apart from giving Indigenous people more resources and more power. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Merci Justin, merci Mylène, vraiment sincèrement, je suis extrêmement désolé des problèmes techniques qu'on a vécu.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Mylène.
Désaccord qui aurait pu être
it would have been easier if we had been in the same room because of technical problems. I thank you very much. So we can make the ending word is self-determination of First Nation, Inuit, and build the right to education, to program that take into account the reality of First Nation over the rights of self-determination. We can all agree on that. And as a conclusion, I will invite you, all of you, to participate to next webinar on April 19, 2020 through the Scandinavian model of incarceration, and we'll invite several Scandinavian experts, Northern